You're listening to Showing Up. Back in episode 31, we had our guest Steve Campbell come on. And we did an episode called The Evangelical Box is Too Small. Now what? Well, he's back. And we have a now what, or at least an inkling, or some changes in his life that have allowed him to move forward and explore new opportunities. So it might be good to go back and listen to episode 31 to get the context for this conversation.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Stephen, welcome back to the Showing Up Palace.
Yes.
We're following up on a conversation that I think in the process of the first one we knew there was inevitable follow-up that would be needed, and Kirk was talking to some of our listeners, and it kind of, I think, begged the question a little too intense. It was like, what are you doing? Where's the rest of Steve's conversation? He was, I think, standing on a precipice, or that's what it kind of sounded like, and so we are here for that follow-up to, I guess it's a check-in, and
Sure.
I think very aptly with how Kirk and I's relationship started and where we're at and where we both have sort of done the whole sine wave, ebb and flow on our own spiritual journeys. We were talking earlier, there's a response necessary in the questions you were asking, and so the way we each handle those responses is, I think, what we're about here, and kind of diving into that. From there, I think we'll just jump back in. Let's see if we can do a bit of a quick little recap.
Oh, okay, sure.
That would help to jog everyone's memories, but we can refer to the
Or they can
previous
also just
episode.
go back and listen to the previous episode.
Yep, and we'll have this one out next, and it'll flow right into a couple hours of...
But I think receiving the premise might be interesting about the box.
Yeah, it was kind of funny how that metaphor emerged as the conversation unfolded, and then became, really kind of the theme of our chat.
Yeah.
But this idea that the evangelical box is too small, we talked quite a bit about what some of the sides of that box were.
Right.
It was funny because I went back thinking about recording this one, and so I went back and I re-listened to that just as a, what did we talk about? It's kind of,
What do we think?
Yeah. And it was so interesting because there were a number of phrases that since that conversation I feel like have synchronized in me more, solidified more, that brings more clarity. Is this on the fringe of the box? Are we moving beyond the box? And we hinted at this language. I now understand it better, and this concept of include and transcend, that there's this, you don't ever really leave anything behind of what you've experienced before. You take all of that with you.
Right.
And I think at one point toward the end of that conversation, Kirk, you made a statement about something kind of like, you do see all of that from a different perspective now, in a different place. And that for sure has been happening since that conversation for me. That has happened since then, that I have got some real clarity on, is that it is time for me to take some steps beyond that box. I won't say out of that box, I'll say beyond now because of this include and transcend idea. I got to a point where I recognized that our local church body was in need of new vision. Every organization, you need to revisit vision. Where are we? Where have we been? Where are we going? You go through seasons where that just needs refreshing. And we were in that space. I'd been the lead pastor of the church for almost 12 years. Things had, a number of pieces had shifted, and I just, from my leadership training experience, knew we needed to make it was time to kind of reassess that. And in that process, I had this realization that, yes, this church needs new vision, and I realize I am not the person who's supposed to be helping to lead them into whatever that new vision is, because that's not where my heart and vision were moving. I think we did use this language a little bit in the last episode. So rather than being a pastor of a church in Reading, I believe I'm being moved into a realm of pastoring in the broader community without being connected to a body. And as I have kind of made this sort of public move of, okay, I need to not be in that space anymore, it has been really interesting the number of other people since that has kind of been, I've made that revelation to, that have started talking to me about their own parallel experience to that. I was at a gathering a week ago. Somebody who was there had listened to that podcast. And one of the things that they said was, I couldn't believe, as I was hearing you articulate all of those things, how much I was resonating with what you were saying and saying to myself, yes, that's exactly why I don't feel like I fit in that box anymore either. You know, said some sort of version of, yeah, totally get that. I resonate with those feelings.
What do you think that is? Do you think it's a kind of general consciousness shift in this time of life and stuff, or do you think it's more local? Do you think it's what do you think, or is that kind of under the top layer at many different places, and there's something that is kind of become stale, that isn't allowing for that conversation to happen in general?
I think that what this is not local. I think this is very, very broad, and I think it is directly connected to the wave of postmodernity reaching critical mass within the broader sort of spectrum of humanity. So many of the early ideas of postmodernity, lived in the realm of academia and, kind of that realm of theoretical thought. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door, he didn't have a whole crowd of people there with him when he was doing that. It starts with individuals who are beginning to think about, wrestle with ideas, trying to understand what's happening, what's shifting, what's moving. But then eventually it picks up significant critical mass. And I think a part of what's happening is we're beginning to see that this is reaching critical mass in terms of its life in the flow of organized, particularly evangelical Christianity. And unfortunately, I think it's happening a lot by age demographic. If you look at some of the trends in terms of like Pew Research and Gallup polls and some of that kind of stuff, they'll bear out the fact that, the fastest growing religiously defined group in our society is the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who don't identify with a segment of any form of religiosity. And when you put that on a curve or on a graph that goes opposite of age spectrum, it's this inverse, So the lower the age, the higher the nones are. Yeah. The higher the age, the lower the nones are. There's a lot of reasons behind why that is a part of the reality. But to me, that's another illustration of this is reaching a critical mass point where things are shifting, and we're probably approaching a point where we're not going to come back from an edge of some kind. I don't know what that is.
We're going through.
Yeah.
Like what's on the other side, or is this is this the thing, or are we don't know. But
if you look
the
back,
retrenchment crowd doesn't feel like they're gonna.
Well, and to come back to another thing that Jared was saying a second ago that was implied in your question was this broader sort of what we are feeling and sensing in the broader realm of just our world, and it's impacting every realm of life, politics, religion, all of that kind of stuff. And what we see is that there's this entrenchment that's happening by those who have been in power in an attempt to try and hang on to it when the locus of power is beginning to shift to a new space, and we don't know what fully that new space is going to mean. And so then that means that there's fear.
Yep.
And so then we're reacting against the fear and trying to grab a hold tighter, and that doesn't help.
Yep.
Right? There's this, so it all plays in together. And I think we're all feeling that right now. I think we're feeling that in every facet of our life and world.
Can you give us your framework on what you mean by postmodernity? I'm not sure all the listeners are going to either have the same idea of that word or even know what it might mean.
So we hinted at it last time.
Oh, okay.
When we talked about the Wesleyan quadrilateral,
right,
and the different ways that I have worked with and envisioned that, right? It started with the parallelogram, then moved to a Venn diagram, and now
we did talk about that.
Now it's this tricycle,
metaphor,
right? With experience in the front, you've got tradition and scripture at the back wheels that are the stabilizing pieces, and then the person on the tricycle with their brain is reason, right?
Yeah.
Well, that to me is an illustrative example of the essence of what postmodernity is, the shift to postmodernity. So when we think about modernity, everything was all about fact, proof, order, line it all up, put your ducks in a row. It was characterized by certainty, right? And, when you translate that into the realm of, say, the church life, you get things like, this is this interpretation of this scripture.
Yep. Definitive,
right?
Yep.
Bang. And if you read this any other way than this, you're wrong.
Right.
Right. It creates very much, it plays, modernity was very much the age that played into the dualistic mind, right? That this or that either, the or, we have to define it. It's got to be clear. It's got to be true. And that's all real, right?
Yeah.
Well, what we've begun to experience in postmodernity is what we have claimed to be certain, we now find out isn't as certain as we thought it was. And so then we go, well, now what do we do with that? One of my favorite places to think about this, partially because of my son, Seth, and his love of all things physics and astrophysics, is in the realm of actually quantum mechanics and quantum physics. They're just making all these discoveries in science, right? Which was one of the primary products of modernity, right? Scientific thought, test thought. You make a hypothesis, you test it, you prove it, right? You come out with a proof, right? I can remember in school doing that. And now, though, the deeper that the science is pushed, we're beginning to discover things like the space in between the molecules. There's stuff happening that we can't understand and that might be more important than what's actually happening with the molecules themselves. The relationship that exists between those things. I recently read a thing that talked about there's some new science that is discovering that trees talk to each other.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Unbelievable. What? Like, we now have the ability scientifically to actually demonstrate, even though we can't explain it all yet, or we can't, fully grasp what it is.
Yeah.
The metaphor that we have for it is the trees are talking to each other. And you hear somebody say that and you're like, what is wrong with you? Right? And yet this is what we're finding, right? Yeah. That just creates all kinds of uncertainty and begins to rattle foundations and, so what we're having to do is say, okay, well, what I thought was true isn't lining up with my experience of what I'm actually experiencing, what is actually happening to me and to my life and to my world. So how do I then begin to rectify those things?
Yeah.
Am I going to dismiss my experience and claim my certainty? Or am I going to say, what is it about my certainty that I need to adjust? This is the essence of postmodernity, I think.
It seems like we took a lot of that heady feeling around the certainty that we seem to be capturing over hundreds of years.
Right.
We seem to have also built moral structures out of it.
Correct.
Or worldviews, ways of, grand narratives that allowed us to look at the world in particular ways. And then that becomes truth, right? But it's really, in my mind, it's more like the meaning that we attached to facts, right? Or the story that we created around the facts that we discovered so far.
Right.
And then that meaning broke.
We referenced back to my doctoral program and how that was such an explosion in my life. One of the very first sort of pieces of dynamite in that process that went off for me was in a class with one of my primary professors, Len Sweet. And he just tossed this little thing out, which ended up being basically a stick of dynamite that went off in my life. And he said, what if instead of truth being a postulate, what if when Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, what he actually meant was him. And that truth isn't an idea. Truth is a person. And therefore, it has to be grounded in relationship. Talk about your whole world blowing up in a moment, because so much of modernity and the construct of modernity is that truth is an idea. Truth is a concept. Truth is something that we can get to. If truth is about a relationship, and in particular, in our tradition, relationship with a person, Jesus the Christ, we all instinctively know there's nothing simple, easy, or concrete about a relationship.
Right.
Now, you, Jer, you could say at this point in your life, with your relationship with your wife, as an example, you love her more than you've probably ever loved her. That love has grown, it's deepened, it's, but when you loved her, when you got married, you loved her fully then too, right?
Right, yeah.
But now it's different. So you could say that love has been a certainty in your relationship, but it certainly hasn't been a constant the same way that we think about
what is constant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because we instinctively sort of know this.
Yeah.
But so part of what's happening is there is this massive shift that's occurring that's more about relationship and less about structure, institution, postulates, dogmas, proofs, all those kind of things. And I think that's what's resonating with so many more people these days.
I'm trying to listen through a few different
of course.
lenses. What if someone calls foul and says, this sounds like relativism to you? What do you say about that?
Well, that's a great question. And I think I know how it can sound that way.
Well, there's the assumption that this person thinks relativism is bad. I just know a whole swath of people,
of course.
But I'm just curious.
No, absolutely, yeah. And there is a way to hear all of this through that lens. A couple of nuances there. One, that assumes, you're right, that relativism is bad and that certainty is the thing we must seek. But when the certainty we seek is based in relationship, it's now become relative. Because relationship is not static. Right. It's dynamic. It's moving. So it's not as if we're saying there is no certainty and everything is just relative to whatever I think, whatever I feel, right? No, we're not saying that either. What's happening, though, is that we're recognizing that there is a both and that is at work here, not an either or. And usually when there's an objection to this being all relativity, it's from that space of, no, you have to have either or. There's a desire to cling to the certainty that we know. But if what we could do in that moment, and again, that's not about a moment, that's about a journey. But if what we can do is we can travel this journey that says, I'm going to allow the certainty that I have not to rest in my ideas, but to rest in the power of the relationships that exist. Right? The fact that I was doing a little journaling this morning about reminding myself, and somebody else that I actually encountered this morning, there is not a single thing any of us can ever do to not be loved by our Creator. Ever. Well, I'm making a really certain claim in stating that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a very profound, direct certitude that I'm proclaiming. But it's a certitude that's based in a relational reality. And there's nothing black and white about a relationship.
Yeah.
So there's this, so how do you characterize the love of your Creator that's just never going to stop? Okay, well, good luck with that.
It's not
right?
a list.
Right.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned it as a relational reality. Would you say that's experientially reality?
Mm-hmm. And again, I this is where I think if we come back to the tricycle, and since our last conversation, I've discovered I'm not the only person who envisions this.
The tricycle?
Mm-hmm.
Ah.
Yeah, Richard Rohr actually he doesn't put the person on the tricycle with the reason piece that is the Wesleyan quadrilateral, but he talks about the tricycle of the front wheel being experience and the back two wheels being tradition and scripture.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, which I actually didn't. I found out. I don't know, about a month after we recorded.
Yeah. I remember
episode.
the first time you drew that. I was like, that's good.
Yeah,
Apparently it is.
So yeah, but there's this sense of it's a relational, foundational reality. I don't know. I forgot what you asked.
Well, the experiential aspect, because it's funny, I say that and I agree with you, but I can imagine a lot of people going, I actually don't feel like I experienced that, even though that is, I believe it to be true, but our experience then is also filtered through so much that if that is the sort of plumb line or guide for truth, there's just some interesting questions there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what we have to remember is that experience isn't a unicycle we're riding.
That's right.
This is a tricycle we're riding. And that what the tradition of the church and the foundation of Scripture continue to provide us is a stabilizing reality as we work with our experience to figure out what we need to do. The problem has been we've tried to allow those other pieces to be the front wheel that's steering the ship. And different traditions have put different wheels on the front of the tricycle. You know, a part of what the Protestant Reformation was about was the Catholic Church had put tradition on the front wheel, and the Protestants came along and said, no, the Scripture needs to be the front wheel of this tricycle. Well, now we're in a place where we're putting experience on the front wheel and the other two in the back, and that makes people nervous because neither one of those wheels have ever been in, either one or the other of those have always been in the front, right? So it makes people nervous about that, but it's not as if we're saying that we're throwing those out. No, those are still going to remain and they're going to help us. But as I said, I think in the last episode, we have to be willing to acknowledge that it's honest to say none of us come to either of those pieces without bias, without a framework of already understanding that, quite frankly, is relative. We just don't want to admit that.
It reinserts the uncertainty.
It does.
To my ears, though, it also reestablishes the need for faith.
Absolutely.
What's interesting is when my faith gets challenged, which I more frequently am allowing that to happen, and it's scary, it reminds me that it is only an experience of God that is actually going to recenter that for me.
Reground you.
And when I listen to other people talk, and we'll be talking conceptually, and then they will talk about an experience they had, and it has a whole different, it's like, that's why they believe what they believe. All this conceptual talk is, my favorite one was I listened to a 2-hour podcast of philosophers, right, talking about theism as a worldview in the world.
Sure.
One of them, there's probably 2 agnostics, an atheist, and a theist in the conversation.
Sure.
And they went out for hours and they broke down all the different proofs of God, and they did all this stuff, and they tore it all apart, and they did all the philosophical work. It was great. And at the end, the theist, who had fully engaged in all this, he goes, guys, but here's the thing. I don't know anybody who anchors their faith on any of that.
Mm.
It's always an experience.
True.
I was like, yeah, that was fun 2 hours, but
Mm-hmm.
meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
Not meaningless. It's interesting.
Yeah.
That experience is what. It's just like having your marriage be built on an agreement, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
Make an agreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't experience the agreement over and over and over, and then tell the story of the agreement, and then add to the experience, and then refine the agreement, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to work.
Yeah. Very good analogy. So would you say that the Campbellian tricycle is a way of describing what is rather than what should be?
Yes, it's just a metaphor for us to try and understand what's happening, how we are engaging with the world, with ideas, with reality. Right? There's one of the things I was thinking as you were talking about that 2-hour conversation, Kirk, was all of those ideas and all of those words are because somebody had an experience that they're trying to figure out how to talk about.
Yeah, that's right. Huh.
Yeah.
That just happened.
Right, exactly.
How do I make meaning from that? How do I talk to somebody else about it?
Exactly.
How do I put that inside of language?
Exactly.
Because it's transcendent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's so much of what I think is at the heart of what's happening with this shift in post-modernity, is that we're having these experiences, and these experiences aren't lining up fully with what we have been taught we are supposed to experience in life, because this is the way it all works, because we have gotten to a place of certainty. And so if we've reached a place of certainty, then we're able to tell you, this is certainly what you will experience. And then I don't experience that, and I go, what's wrong with me? How have I somehow missed that? And then we have it reaching this point of critical mass where there's just enough people that are experiencing similar and the same kinds of things that we're going, wait a minute. This isn't just me being off on my rocker in left field by myself. There's something happening here. When you look back through history, there have been about every 500 years, there has been a major move and a major shift within the realm of the world's understanding of how we all connect to, relate with each other, and with this thing called God. You can just look at it. It just goes bang, 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 bang. Well, 2 years ago, we celebrated the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So we're due.
The earthquake is happening.
It is. And we can either make a decision that we just need to stop it, or begin to try and say, okay, God, what are you doing here? Because I don't think he's void from this process. In fact, I think he's the active agent in the midst of it. And he's trying to draw us into a new level of understanding and relating to him and to one another. But I don't want to keep him in his box. I want to say, okay, where can we go to explore, to find, to discover new vistas and new reality?
Based on the questions you're asking, the decisions you're making in life, and how those are actually bringing about practical change in your world, are there any things that you notice that are practically different?
That's interesting, because I don't think I've ever described it quite like this before, but in this dialogue, it's kind of given me a new idea, a new metaphor maybe. I feel like a part of what God is leading me to is trying to help be a stabilizing guide for people as they try and explore in those spaces. I'll give you a practical example of that. I had a conversation with somebody recently, and they asked me a very, very particular question about a particular issue. And I answered them. And
Can you tell us what the issue was?
They
just made me too curious.
Yeah, they asked.
It's not.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's just another hot button that might take us on a tangent. But I'll just say that it was an issue related to sexuality.
Sure. Okay.
And they asked me this question, and I was happy to dialogue with them about it and answer them. And in that course of that conversation, as I reflected on it later, one of the things that I felt like that was being asked between the lines was, is there somebody that I view from a position of authority because of that sort of pastor hat, if you will, who's willing to give me permission to think and wrestle with this stuff?
Right.
Like they never asked me that, right? When they asked me the question, they never said, do you think it's okay for me to wrestle with these ideas?
Right.
But that, as I reflected on it later, that was thickly implied. And the reason I knew that was because when I gave them my answer, it was like they exhaled.
Yeah.
It was like they went, oh, I'm safe.
That's exactly it.
It's so interesting, isn't it?
So dangerous to ask these questions and to play on the edge. And I think it's only dangerous because the communities we're coming out of described it as dangerous.
Right.
But that's the experience. It feels like I'm off the map. I'm scouting.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't it be cool if there was somebody out in that wilderness with you who had a leadership? It's not leadership, but
no, it isn't.
It's more like had done some deeper thinking, read more books, had broad thoughts, something about there's a work you've done with your whole life.
True.
That prepares you in a particular way that the rest of us just haven't done.
You know,
and can you, it's like at the very least, can you tell me when I'm so far off track that I'm violating tradition or scripture or even reason? Because I'm playing with this idea and it's fascinating, but and even the ability to go, you know what, about 300 years ago, people played with that idea and it didn't go well.
Right.
I mean, that's cool to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like that.
Or even just the ability to deal in nuance. Because there's so little nuance.
Right.
When even the language of that's dangerous versus that's costly. It's not dangerous. It's not dangerous, but you're playing costly territory. So just know when you make decisions, probably best to do micro for a bit until you figure out the playing field, and then just you can start.
Be able to articulate that thing you're best with right there. Like go for it, but you should know that you got to be careful with some of these other relationships,
right?
Who aren't necessarily going to go with you.
Totally, totally.
There's a cost
and
involved.
Part of the cost,
And how do you do that in a loving way, or a redemptive way? Those sort of questions instead of an aggressive and argumentative and. Like, keep that one off Facebook for a bit. Just that's probably not the best place to have that conversation.
Yes.
Because, that's the best place to have all conversations, right?
Right.
Oh, my God.
At least to process the conversation.
Right,
exactly.
To do the work of really understanding what you think.
To just dig into the
feedback you get.
The comment section alone is just so fun. And,
But to have people guide, right? This is a destabilizing experience for people who are not necessarily thinking about it as deeply or as spending as much mind, but like it's been your
it's my bread and butter for a long time.
Yeah, you've been in this subject for a long time, thinking deeply about it. And for a lot of people, they're running into it everywhere they look, but it's like. What do I do, and how do I navigate my marriage, and how do I raise my kids in this questioning, and how do I all that stuff. And it's destabilizing. What do you say to those people?
It's a great question. I think I start with you can trust Spirit in whatever form or fashion you call that. And even if you don't think that thing exists, whatever that is, I have experienced enough of that Spirit to know that Spirit is working for you and with you and for your good and is wanting you to find greater and greater wholeness in your life. And so first I would say, trust spirit. Second, interestingly enough, and there will be people who'll be like, well, there he goes off into that relativism again, right? But
we're not currently talking to them.
I know. But
yeah,
I would say trust yourself too. Trust yourself. That it's this is that questioning, that wrestling, that it's so beautiful and it's so good, and there is no foul in it anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll quickly follow that up with, certainly I think it's possible to just, run off the rails, right? But if you start with a place that says trust spirit, and then from there you say, so go ahead and trust yourself too, because those two things will work in tandem in a way that are just going to produce nothing but goodness and beauty. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always going to come out rosy. No. So I recently have been, the series I'm teaching on right now is on this text in the New Testament called the fruit of the Spirit. And a few weeks ago, I did a teaching on the one called faithfulness. And so we looked at the ideas of the concepts of faith versus belief. And I talked about faith being like a set of glasses that God gives us because God has a different perspective on the world than we do. And faith is attempting to see the world through God's eyes, not through ours. Trying to begin to see the world as God sees them, trying to see others through the lens of God, not through our lens. That's what faith is. And then what belief is belief is on our side of the equation, and whether we're willing to actually believe and trust what we're seeing through God's eyes, through his lenses, the lens of faith. When I was talking about that, I said, but we have to remember that these faith glasses of God are not like rose-colored. They aren't rose-colored. This isn't a call to everything's going to be okay, right? Do I believe God is in the business of making everything okay eventually? Yeah, I do, actually. That's another whole probably 82 podcasts, but this is destabilizing, and there's beauty in the destabilizing, and it's good, and if you're willing to live with it and work through it and wrestle through it on the other side, there is greater wholeness, greater health, greater goodness. I don't even, something like that is possible, but that is also very real, right? This isn't Pollyanna either. It's not like everything's just going to be okay. No, this is work. Right? This is wrestle. But it's good, and it's gonna produce life and wholeness and goodness. And one of the things that we don't want to talk about a lot of times is that if you're going to actually have resurrection life, there has to be a death.
Boom. We don't like that.
We don't like that. I love Jim Gaffigan. And he has this whole bit that he does about fall and about how we celebrate the leaves turning color, and it's all of them in their death cycle.
Yeah.
Like, what if we could hear them talk? They'd be like, no, they're dying. Right?
Yeah.
Every year they all come to watch. Morbid people.
Exactly, right? So he does this whole bit, which I just, think is a hilarious take on that whole thing. And yet there's a reality there.
So true.
That you don't get to spring without going through fall and then the dead of winter. You don't get to resurrection life without there being death. We want resurrection, but we don't want the death that comes with it. And in this work, the equivalent of the death is the question, the wrestle, the doubt, and it's very destabilizing. It's very destabilizing. And most of the people quit that journey because that's so hard.
Yeah.
Or they aren't given permission to continue that journey.
Too dangerous.
It's too dangerous.
Don't do that. Don't question.
And what I am hopeful for is that if we can have enough people in enough spaces and enough places where we can say to folks, oh no, you press into that destabilizing.
Okay.
You lean into those doubts and those questions and those wrestles, because there is incredible resurrection life on the other side of those. Oh, and by the way, after that, you'll die again.
You'll do it again.
Okay?
Yeah. In fact, I don't know which one is the end point of that cycle.
Exactly.
Right.
From the start point.
Exactly.
Right.
I'm going to do an end here.
Let's do it.
I
Okay.
haven't done this in a long time.
Oh, boy.
A lot of what this podcast is focused on is spiritual journeys. And it's framed in the idea of everything spiritual.
Yes, for sure.
So it's a journey to anything and anywhere, and it's all these different kinds of journeys. all
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
absolutely.
But at the core of it, by going on spiritual journeys, one of the things that we believe about that is it is imperative to be on those journeys in order that you can show up as the best version of yourself.
Mm.
Right? Showing up.
The very premise of the podcast,
That's right.
not mine, this one, the whole big
The whole
enchilada.
thing, you know. How do you show up as the best version of yourself? Well, part of the answer is go on a spiritual journey
Yes.
and die, right? And
Yeah.
and then come back to us.
Good
right?
news. Yeah.
The question then becomes about you.
Okay.
Who are you, and where are you showing up as the best version of yourself? Well, we've heard stories around that.
Mm-hmm.
We're watching you go through that process in real time. It turns out.
Yeah, in real time.
So, what are you all about?
Mm. I'm all about being a companion with people in a way that is, I think, life-giving, permission-giving, hope-giving, to say, yes, go ahead, take that journey. It's okay to take that step, and I want to travel it with you. I want to take it with you.
There's a number of people who are listening who I believe would be early adopters to that space that you're describing, because I know it's not fully formed yet.
Right.
But I'll bet you that there are people listening right now who are like, would love to have coffee with that guy. I'd love to work with that guy. I want to go on a retreat. In fact, I had that question after the last one from people, and the answer was, well, he's here every Sunday morning,
Right.
which didn't feel like a really profound answer to
Yeah.
the people who were asking that, right?
Yeah, because that's a space. That's a space that's
conditioned
hard for
differently.
them.
Yeah, it's just a
For
different.
some of them.
Yeah, can they engage you?
Absolutely.
look like?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, the simplest way is probably through my center platform, which is findmycenter.net. There's a contact us button there, and that just sends me an email.
Yeah. Findmycenter.
Findmycenter.net. That's probably the fastest, easiest portal for people.
I have walked with this guy a lot. If that description of where you are resonates with you,
Yeah.
just reach him, get out there.
Yeah, I
come
love
get
it.
him.
I'd absolutely love it.
I have no idea what that'll look like.
It's exciting and scary and challenging and just so full of life.